is it wise to tell the person you desire to pursue or get into a courtship your life story, which includes the traumatic experiences you have gone through, or should you hold back certain details about your past until after marriage? So let me try to summarize the question if people didn't quite get it. You have found somebody, you're in a courtship with them, separate to where you are in your courtship, beginning, middle or end. The question is, how much information should you give your potential partner about your past life? All of us agree that you should give information about your past. Of course, that's obvious. The question is there some information, sensitive information, if we can call it that you would not give? And the questioner asks, should you wait to give that information until after you marry, not before? So my response to that question is this: if you're ever going to tell your partner something about your past, that should always be done before marriage, not after marriage. So the question was framed about telling them something sensitive and when should you tell them. The question was not if you should tell them. So if the question is when should you tell them, the answer I would say is before, never afterwards. If it's worth telling them, you should tell them before you marry them, not afterwards. Because telling them afterwards really, I think, is doing a disservice to yourself and to them. So a question that wasn't asked but that is connected to this is the following: is there something about your past life that you should not tell your partner? Which means then that you would never tell them. This is a more problematic issue. If you're not going to tell them, you need to be sure that you'll never have the need nor the desire to ever tell them this issue. And I don't know if people can here think about something that they would say, well, this is definitely something that I would never ever tell my partner, because they never need to know this, so I'm going to commit to never mentioning it. But if you have a doubt or you have a fear that you may need to talk about it, that it may become relevant, then I think that you should make a conscious decision to inform them before marriage, not afterwards. And if there is something that you're not sure about, I think either you should be seeking counsel from someone that you trust and ask them what their thoughts are upon this specific issue, or whether or not you should tell someone this point or not. Because if you're not sure whether or not you should tell them, I would suggest that you should err upon the side of full disclosure. I think it's far better to do that. So, before or after marriage? 100% before. If you're not sure, there's this huge thing that you're not sure whether or not you should tell, I think you should seek for counsel from someone. Now, if it's so sensitive that you don't want to tell your potential spouse, maybe you don't want to ever tell anybody, and so you're going to be stuck in that dilemma, of course. But it's left for you to decide. My thoughts are to err on the side of telling your potential partner everything about you. Now, the problem in that is, when would you tell the person? At the beginning, the middle, or the end of your courtship? I think if we were to think of it as a sliding scale, there is more that you tell your potential partner as you go through this relationship with them, as you go through the courtship. And the more you go through that courtship, the more you should tell them about your life history, who you are, whatever things in the past that you think that they need to know about you. There is sensitive information that you wouldn't tell someone at the beginning, but you'd have to wait until you get well on into the process of courtship that you're certain that you're going to marry. Some things you would tell them after engagement. Engagement is a commitment to marriage, and maybe you don't feel safe to tell them of your issue until you're really sure that you're about to marry. Because obviously when you tell someone something, now you become vulnerable to them, that there's nothing to stop them, of course, from sharing that information with other people, which is, I guess, the fear that people have about not telling people before marriage, but telling them after. Brother Tom.
Have you got an example of something that would not be good to say for engagement that you need to say after the engagement? Because from what I've understood is that you need to know who you're marrying, and that's the whole point of disclosing this information before you get married. But wouldn't that be the case the same before you're engaged in terms of disclosing this thing so that the person knows who they're getting engaged to? Does that make sense?
It does. I can't think of anything specific, and I didn't want to leave the impression that there are things that you should leave until engagement. I do know there are sensitive things about a person's life that they wouldn't want to tell somebody until they're really certain that they're going to marry the person. And so I think the difficulty is how much you're prepared to open yourself up, to expose yourself to this person if there's no certainty that you're going to marry them. Courtships are a funny thing. You might think that they work, not you, I'm just talking generally, one might think that they work on sort of a linear basis, that as you get to know the person better, you become closer to them, and it's just sort of plain sailing all the way through. But those people who have been through a courtship, even if they haven't done it, the Adventist or the conservative way that many of us have gone through or imagine that courtship should look like, however you do it, I think most of us are aware that you hit bumpy parts along the road. And if you were to think of, just as an example, a 12-month courtship and a 6-month engagement, which is 18 months, you might imagine that the first 6 months of courtship are really difficult as you settle into your relationship with this person, that you get to know them. And for the second half of the courtship, as you really get to know them well, that you should become more comfortable around them, and that your relationship would be easier to navigate. I don't want to say improve. I was about to say improve, but I want to say just easier to navigate. You think you might be more free and open to talk, but I don't think it's that straightforward. I think the more people learn about one another, not even just open about some facts, just the more you learn about a person, a courtship can hit a bumpy patch 7-8 months into a 12-month courtship. Even into the 10th and 11th month, you can hit a place in your relationship where you think, actually, I'm not sure even if I want to go forward with this person, whereas 2 months ago you were fully committed to marrying them. And this is without a person even giving some information. So 11 months into the courtship, you might decide to tell them that you were bankrupt before, or you really don't know how to manage money, or you've got a large debt, because you didn't feel safe to tell them. Separate to large bombshells like that, just getting to know someone can get more difficult, can be more problematic the further you go along in your courtship. So I don't think it's that difficult to imagine that a couple are well into their courtship and they're really in a difficult place where they're now saying, I'm not even sure I want to marry this person because of things that they're discovering about their personality, the way that they manage each other. Last week I spoke about people not having the tools of actually how to communicate well. So you could you could be meeting all these problems, and yet you're waiting to tell them, by the way, I have this problem of my past, and it will impact or could impact our future relationship. Maybe you just don't know how even to communicate that because you're already going through a huge issue. So when I say engagement, I would hope that most people would resolve all their things and tell them something before engagement. So if we're going to mark engagement purely as the point in which you ask for someone's hand, and from that moment onward, all you're essentially doing is arranging the wedding, and that all of the work of union, joining yourselves together, has already been done, then I agree that you shouldn't be waiting for engagement to say, after you've said, will you marry me? And then a week later say, by the way, I didn't tell you this huge thing. I think that's the point that you're making, and I would agree with that. So I didn't want to leave you with the thought that first you should take the person's hand in marriage, and then a week later tell them that basically you've got a £20,000 debt and you're bankrupt, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you before. Or, by the way, I didn't tell you, but I've been married 2 times in the past, and I thought I bet let you know. You wouldn't do those kind of things after engagement. I don't know if there's anything that you would wait until after you're engaged, because by the time you're engaged, you've actually asked the person to commit to you. So I didn't want to leave you with the thought that there should be something that's so earth-shattering that you couldn't wait till afterwards. And yet I suspect that there are things that might come about, not because you're holding on to them, but they just might come out after you've actually committed to marry one another. But if there's a conscious thing that you know that you need to talk about, then it should be done before marriage. And I think I agree with Brother Tom that it should really be done before engagement. Sometimes people aren't sure what they can and cannot tell. I think in cases such as this, there are resources that are available that actually take you through a series of questions or scenarios that give you guidance on the kind of things that you should be asking, because sometimes people don't even know what they should ask, and sometimes people don't even know what they should tell, and it's easy for us to say, well, just tell them everything. Of course, you can't tell everybody or somebody everything, because everything, you can't even remember everything. So there are resources that are available that hit the major things that marriage counsellors have, through obviously years of experience, have tackled, that would cover most issues that a couple should be talking about before they marry. I'm hoping that answered the question, and I agree with Brother Tom. I didn't want to leave you with the impression that you've got this big earth-shattering issue point, and you said, I better wait till after we're engaged to tell them. I don't think that's a wise thing to do. What should a Go ahead.
Just to make sure I've understood what you said, I think it's also important not to make it like a hard and fast rule, like you have to disclose everything in engagement, and if you don't after, then you should end the engagement. Okay, what you're saying is that it's best practice to do it beforehand, but there could be circumstances which make it difficult, like you might be navigating to another issue, and then it might be too much, or it might not be in the, for whatever reason. There could be things which spill over, but basically the last place you want to deal with engagement.
Tom, you're breaking up.
Not that you're damned if
Is he breaking up for everyone, or is it just me?
Me as well.
No, it's everyone.
Oh,
You're breaking up, Tom?
Because it's breaking up.
Sometimes you can adjust
So I
it.
didn't, not to make it like a rod to hit people over the
I
head
don't think
with
you can hear
if
us.
they haven't done it before engagement. But best practice is before engagement. Oh, am I breaking up? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
No, I can hear you. You can't hear me.
Carry on.
Okay.
Just backtrack 3 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. No, I was just saying, from what I've understood, you were saying it's basically when you're speaking about these things in engagement, it's more like that's the last place you should technically. It's best practice to do it before engagement, but you're not using that like as a rod of iron to hit people over the head to say you've end the engagement. We can speak about this before the engagement, but it's best practice to speak about it before engagement, and things might spill over into after engagement, and it's just best to do all those things before marriage.
Yes. Some of these things, some of these things are obvious. That you've got into some financial difficulty, that you've been in previous relationships, those kind of things. But there are other things that I think sometimes people may not actually be aware of in and of themselves. Often, courtship is a place, if I can call it a place, it's a place of self-discovery. When you get close to someone, not only are they discovering you, more often than not, because many of us have not actually looked at ourselves closely, this may be the first time in our lives that we actually have a close look at ourselves. And so, whilst we might think of, some specific issue, that I had a gambling problem, or I used to take drugs when I was younger. Besides something like that, which you should be telling people before before engagement, because you know about that. Each of us is going through a journey of discovery, and there are things that we may not realize about ourselves or has come to our conscious understanding until after engagement. And I think that's the point that Brother Tom's making, and I agree with that. There are things that could come to your realization after courtship, and you should tell people, your future spouse, about that. I don't want to make it a point that if you haven't told them before marriage, that means you should not tell them now. Maybe you're already married and you didn't do that, or maybe you are married and you made a mistake, or you did something wrong in not telling them, or you never even realised something. I don't want to say it slipped your memory. That sounds like a get out clause. But even after you're married, I still think there is a place for continual communication and engagement on this issue, that you should still continue to talk about yourselves, because all through marriage it's the means of self-discovery, both of your spouse and of yourself. What should a person do if most people available to marry live overseas? Move to where they are. Move overseas. This is a problem that isn't going to go away. There are so few of us, the likelihood of finding someone in your own locality is not impossible, but it's minimal. What should a person do if most people available to marry is overseas? Is to try to mix and engage. The issue of people marrying someone from a different country is not a new phenomena. In the olden days, they'd call them pen pals, and there are plenty of love stories where people have married and got to know one another through being pen pals, through letters, and they've developed a deep, intimate relationship with someone through writing to them, and they have married successfully. So I don't think, with all the technology that we have today, that it's beyond our means to marry someone who lives abroad. It's harder for sure, but it's not impossible. So I wouldn't want to discourage people from that. One of the things that is difficult is the differences in culture between different countries, and I think that can be more problematic than people realise. People can tend to think, as an example, if you're from Africa, it's a crazy thing to think, but people believe that if you're from Africa, all Africans from the I don't even know how many countries it is, more than 24 countries, that they should all be able to get along with each other. That's like saying all Europeans, because you're from Europe, can all get along with each other, and an English person can easily marry someone from Poland or from Lithuania, whereas we know that there are huge differences in thinking, in practices between those countries. So I think cultural differences can make a big difference. Brother Tom?
Yeah, so just on that question, if you don't mind me expanding on the question, it's not mine, but if I could just expand on it. So I think the question is probably coming from a point of view of the movement and how it is right now. I think it's quite sparse. It's quite sparse in concentrations in different countries. See, like the UK, there's about 15, 20 of us. I don't know. I haven't counted. And probably something you don't want to do is just get married because those are the only people who are available. So in terms of like pen pals and things like that, how does that work in terms of when you're in the movement? Because there's a lot of things to consider. First of all, people strengthen the message and how long they've been, because I think the dynamics in the message is different to anything else that is probably on this earth, in terms of people can fall off or people can be on the message but not quite, so is there room for first of all having counsel, I'll put it that way, like elders advising in terms of having an open channel to be able to inquire. So let's say someone in Brazil finds someone in the UK. Is it okay to just inquire about it? And then the second thing is, how will you actually meet? So if you go to a camp meeting, what level of intentionality is there to get to know somebody? Because if you're at a camp meeting, for example, you see somebody who you might like and the single, do you go up and you just introduce yourself? How does that all work? Because some of the dynamics are kind of contrary to how we like to behave, if that makes sense, as Christians.
So there was a part 2 to this question. It says, if there are not many elders or older brethren of experience to counsel me on what should I do. So the questioner was dealing with this issue of receiving counsel. So I think one of the questions that I got was on matchmaking or seeking advice from someone of experience. Is matchmaking okay if done by older brethren who know you? So the person said older brethren. I'm going to just take the older out. Is matchmaking okay if it's done by brethren who know you? So I think there are valid situations where someone wants to marry and they make their desire known, and someone who has connection in other parts of the world may be able to direct them to someone who may be suitable to them. So I think employing friends or brethren, however you want to name them, to assist you in even finding or locating a partner, I think is a viable and appropriate tool. In fact, most of the time we'll go to Abraham and Isaac and Rebecca, their marriage. Abraham's problem is there's no one locally who can marry his son, and so he's going to have to go abroad to have that work done for him, and he uses someone of experience to obviously find a wife for his son. Now, we might not do it in exactly the same way, of course we wouldn't, but the principle there I think we can use when it comes to an introduction or to get to know someone. So I think it's valid to seek for help. I think it's fine to find someone abroad. So I want to make two more comments, I think probably two. One of them is the question that Brother Tom asked about intentionality. How intentional should we be? Now, when you go somewhere, I'm not saying that our primary focus should be that we're there to find a partner, but I think most of us, if we want to be open and frank about it, those of us who are desiring to be married, when we go somewhere, at the back of our mind, perhaps even at the forefront of our mind, this issue of seeking for a partner is there. And to pretend that it's not there, I think does ourselves a disservice and the potential partner that we're looking for. So I'm not suggesting that we find someone and, you meet a brother at a camp meeting and it's a week camp meeting, and on day 4 you say, oh, by the way, I really like you and I came here to see you or something. I'm not saying that you be so obvious, but on the other hand, I think it doesn't do anyone any good to pretend that we're seeking for a partner when pretend that we're not seeking for a partner when in fact we really are. And if we like somebody, let me say it this way, I think most of us, if you like someone and someone likes you back, even at a very superficial level, we know it. Some people might call it chemistry, some people might give it, a different name, but most people have an awareness if something clicks between them and someone else. So I think this idea to pretend that we're not interested or that we're not seeking for a partner and to skirt around the issue, I think really doesn't do anyone any good. So I'm not saying that we should be open and front and say I came here to marry someone and who's available. But if that's where you are, I think there should be a level of honesty in that. I think seeking help from brethren is also useful. So there's one more point I want to bring up, but I'll let Brother Tom respond back first. Go ahead, Brother Tom.
Yeah, so I think what I was saying was in terms of, how it works generally in the world, unless you go on a dating site, you get to know somebody first, and then you then have the thought in your mind that, okay, this is someone I would like to, someone who you do like. And it works even more so like on the movement, as a Christian, you have to do a lot of observation first or consideration before you actually move into a position where you might have emotions. So, for example, I think what I was talking about intentionality is, let's say there's someone in a different country and you don't even know them, they don't even know you, you don't talk to anybody in the different country, you ask an elder, and the elder says, okay, I think this person would be interesting to you. How do you then go about talking and becoming friends without raising those emotions, if that makes sense? So, by the time you weren't speaking anyway, so by the time you're speaking, you end up in that situation where there's a level of intentionality about it. So, I don't know if my question is making sense or where I'm coming from is making sense, but basically, it's almost like it becomes obvious at that point what the whole point of the friendship is, and could that complicate it? Because you don't really know each other that well.
I think it's difficult whether or not, when you say complicates it, if you mean by complicate it, if you mean jeopardize it, I don't think it jeopardizes anything. It may be different, that you might use the word complicate. I just think it just might be a different way of dealing with the issue. I want to sort of say a couple of points. First of all, I think as Christians, we pretend, if I could say it this way in a stronger way, we lie to ourselves when we think that physical connection or appearance doesn't matter. Now, everyone has their own physical presence about them, and even the world uses this term, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Everyone is beautiful in their own way and in the eyes of someone else. But to pretend that someone's physical makeup, their body, their facial features, whatever it is about their physicality, to pretend that doesn't have any importance to you, each of us, I think is not true. And I think the sooner we can be open about that fact, the better off everyone would be. If the issue of our physical bodies were not so important that we could ignore that and say, it's about their personality, it's about their mind, then intimacy or sex wouldn't have such wouldn't be so important to us if we were so spiritually minded. The fact that part and parcel of us being married is this unity of mind, spirit and body, intimacy, sex, to me indicates the idea that we really need to be comfortable with someone's physical body. And I think from my cursory understanding of psychology, which is not much at all, I think it's been fairly well demonstrated that people can become attached at a physical level, and it's far more important than we as Christians not only imagine that it is, I think pretend that it is. We pretend that physical doesn't matter, that we should worry about the spiritual and the mind and where they are in Christ, good character, all of that. And we pretend, I think amongst ourselves, that the person's body, their physical presence doesn't make a difference. And I think that we actually do a disservice to ourselves and to one another when we perpetuate that untruth. And I'm suggesting that it is an untruth. Everyone is attractive to somebody, but to enter into a relationship where you don't have attraction, I think, is a dangerous proposition. And the reason I mention that in this way is because even if you've never met a person, just by looking at them, and I'm not saying one picture would be enough, because most people just present the better side of themselves, which is dangerous, but just looking at a person physically can give you a really good guide of whether or not you'd be interested in moving things forward with them. I think the idea of getting to know someone from a distance in the way that Tom suggested is difficult, but I think it's manageable. I think it would demand you meeting in person, whether or not that would be, I guess, what the world would call, I don't know what would call it, a blind date or something, or you come there for a specific reason, even if your friends bringing you together. I think those kind of things are not as crazy as we might imagine them to be. I'm going to move on my question, but I just want to make one point on all of this, and it's the following. I mentioned about 100 years ago, someone would be a pen pal with someone, and they would marry. They'd have a picture or two of one another. They'd like the picture. They'd get to know them through the letters, and they would marry. And we would never imagine doing something like that today. If I were to say, just WhatsApp someone for about 6 months, you never met them, and then you commit to marrying them, all of us would say no. And so the question arises, why are relationships nowadays so much more problematic? Why are they so much harder? Why things are so much more difficult today than they have been in the past, when people want to marry. Most of us in the movement are pretty decent people. Why can't we just pair people up and say, well, this is an attractive looking woman and this is an attractive looking man. They both have the same beliefs. Everything kind of looks... Everything looks okay on the surface. Why can't they seem to be a good match? Why can't they connect one to another? Why do people find it so difficult? Why do people find it so hard that what looked like... Okay, so I'll backtrack a bit. My question is, why do people struggle so much to find the perfect partner today? Whereas in the past, it never seemed that complicated, never seemed that difficult. If you can imagine your parents, they didn't go through all these difficulties that we seem to go through in marrying. Now you could argue that many of our parents' marriages were dysfunctional, were not good because they didn't do their, I'll call it due diligence in finding out about the partner. But I want to give an alternative reason. Every single one of us, by nature, craves affection. We just call it love. We crave to be loved. It's inbuilt within us. We cannot avoid that. And we will seek for love wherever we get that. Now, in the past, by and large, most societies lived close together. If you didn't live in the same house as your grandparents and your parents and yourselves, so you'd have intergenerational households in a single unit, which many societies had. If you didn't have that, you lived in a small community where you knew everybody and everybody knew you, like a small town or a village or a little small suburb or on your street. People knew you and you knew people to quite an intimate level. So what I want to suggest is that in the past, many of us actually felt loved. And what I mean felt loved is that they felt an attachment at multiple levels with many relationships. So if I can borrow a phrase from people who are into courtship and marriage counselling, your love tank was full. If I can use that kind of an idea, if you can imagine it that way. Now today, our demand for love and affection hasn't changed. The problem is, most of us do not have close relationships, either with friends, but particularly with families. And we no longer have communities. So you could live on a street, even in suburbia somewhere, and you don't even know the person who lives next door to you. You've never perhaps even been in their house. You don't know the person who lives opposite you. It's quite a common phenomena that we don't know the people in our community. We work long hours and sociable hours. We don't make friendships with people that we work with, and we're distant from our families. So basically, we are emotionally drained in the sense that we don't have close attachments. We don't have people who love us. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why we become so picky, so, if I can say this word, I don't mean to mean in a detrimental way, so finicky about choosing the person that we're going to marry, because essentially, is it okay? I'm getting feedback. I don't know if someone's got their microphone on or... so I'll carry on until I'm stopped. It's because so many of us actually don't have emotional attachment anywhere, and the only place we're going to get it is from this person that we are attached to, or that we found at a courtship. And this is why we demand so much of that person. We become very demanding in a way that previous generations had not demanded, because they could get love and affection from other relationships, pre-marriage and post-marriage. And most of us are not in that situation nowadays. And that's why I think we find it so difficult to actually find somebody, because we have such a high standard. It's not so much that we're more clued up, we're more savvy today. I think that is true, but I think the fundamental reason why we're so demanding is not because we are more demanding than we were in the past. I think it's because our needs have not been met in other relationships, and they never are met in other relationships. We're distant from the people that we love, friends and families. And so the only person that most of us have got is our spouse, and that's why we expect so much from our spouse. And that's one of the reasons why relationships are very difficult to form, because we don't have loving, trusting relationships with other people. And so the only reason I mentioned all of that is that compounds the problem that most of us are facing when we don't have potential partners close to us. It's not just that it's very difficult to find a partner, it's that many of us are more fussy today. And the reason we're fussy is not just because we're more picky, it's not because we're more educated or we're more demanding, it's because we actually expect this partner to fulfill multiple roles that in the past other people, other relationships that we would have would be fulfilled, at least even partially fulfilled with other people, so we could turn to them. And at the moment, for most of us, there's nowhere for us to turn. So we expect an enormous amount from our partners, which is why I think we've become so careful about who we marry. And that's why I think it's so difficult for people to actually find a partner and just be happy with them. Next question. Is there a safe age range gap between couples? So basically this is about the age gap between couples, and the example someone's given is 24 and 33. So I don't know who the question is, but 24 and 33 sounds like nothing. That's 9 years, is that? Yeah, 9 years to me sounds like nothing. I think what is of interest, besides age gap, is would a man be happy to marry a woman that's 9 years older than him? So that to me is more of an intriguing question. Forget the number. Most men feel uncomfortable marrying a woman that's older than them. So that's something to seriously consider. Separate to the fact of having children and of coming of childbearing age and all the complexities of that, separate to that, I think most men tend to feel uncomfortable marrying a woman that's older than them. I'm going to just add one more piece, a bit to that. Most men find it uncomfortable to marry a woman that's taller than them. So that's not to do with age, but it's just to do with their physical presence. Many men feel intimidated by tall women. Sometimes men can feel intimidated by a woman who's more educated than them. So all those stereotypes, I think all of us have to basically, overcome the issue of height, the issue of education. So I guess everyone has their own ideas and their own thoughts about age disparity. Now, the counsel that Ellen White gives is that there should not be a large age gap between a couple, and the way she phrases that is that the man shouldn't be much older than the wife, because in her time period, it would just be unheard of for a man to marry an older woman. She would be looked upon as some kind of woman of disrepute for that to happen. So the framework of Ellen White's counsel always tends to be from the sexist perspective. So her counsel is there shouldn't be a large age gap. The question is, what is a large age gap? And second to that, there are very specific examples in Ellen White's own history where she breaks her own rules. There are two examples that come to mind. One of them is a retired pastor. The retired pastor is 70 years old, 70, and he has fallen in love with a woman who is 35 years old. So she's exactly half of his age. and they're in love with one another, they want to marry, and his children are older than the woman that he wants to marry. I think they're in their 40s. And to be blunt, they think this is disgusting that their father would want to marry, a young woman. They just think it's the thought of it repulses them. Ellen White, on the other hand, reprimands the children, the man's children, and says, let them marry if they want to marry. It's their decision, it's their choice. And she had no objection in a 35-year-old woman marrying a 70-year-old man. So that's one example. And another example is her own son. I would say her oldest son, but it's not her oldest one. It's the oldest one that's living. I think his name's William. She calls him Willie. His first wife dies, and I think he's in his late 30s or early 40s. So I'm going to say he's around 40, and he finds a woman. I think she's in her 20s. So I'm going to say
21.
that. Sorry?
21.
21. So I'm going to say that he's 40 and she's 20. So again, he's double her age. And for most of us, we would find that some people might find it disgusting, reprehensible, unusual. Whatever people would think about it, it was strange in her day and age, and people find it strange in our day and age. But again, she has no problems in endorsing that marriage. And in fact, her son does marry, and in the first case, that man doesn't marry this sister. He listens to his children, and Ellen White says that was a bad decision on his part. Sorry?
It was a shame.
Yeah, she says it was a shame. So the general principle is that there shouldn't be a large disparity, but I think each case has to be on its own merits. And the reason that she gives is that in older age, that the older person, which tends to be the man, would then lean too heavily upon his younger wife, and he would basically wear down her strength because she would have to take care of him. So that's her major argument. He wouldn't be able to provide for his children as he got into retirement and they were coming of age. He wouldn't be able to address the needs of a young child. So the inference is that a 60-year-old father would not meet the needs of a 10-year-old child in the same way that a 30-year-old father would. If you can just imagine the connotation and the reasoning behind that. So they're the reasons Ellen White gives. Besides that, I don't think there's any reason why people cannot marry someone else who is not of their age. It's a shame that in our culture that younger men find it difficult, I don't know what to say, have a problem in marrying elder women, but it's rare that you find it the other way around. It's very rare that you'll find a problem that a 45-year-old man marrying a 35-year-old woman. Most people just think there's nothing wrong with that, it's normal. But it's the other way around that people will have seem to find it unusual, and I don't know why that is. Besides the ability to bear children, there is no real reason for that. So I don't think there's a problem in having an age gap. And it says 24 to 33. But if we said a couple was 64 and 73, I think people would say, oh, they're about the same age. There's no difference. The older you get, 9 years looks like nothing. It looks different when you're younger. If we were to say 18 and 27, people would say, oh, that seems unusual. The older you get, that age gap doesn't look as bad. So I personally don't think that there's any real reason why people can't marry who have got an age gap. And I gave 2 examples where the age gap is substantial by any measure. It's double the age. So if you're younger and old, or old, should I say, that should hopefully give you some hope.
Can we say it's sexism then, that the woman can't be older and the man younger? Is this a product of society that women have to be sexual, young and attractive, and it's a man's world, and that's why they've been able to marry all these young women, and women can't do it the other way around? And they put a massive stigma on that because it looks like he's with his mother or whatever it is. I don't know. Is that the only reason? I've heard Sophie say that.
I heard someone say it. Was that Sister Sophie? Was that you?
Yes, it was, and I completely agree with you. And I think the connotation, if you look in society, when an older man gets with a young woman, it's like, oh, that's brilliant. She's got loads of vitality. But it's a double standard because I don't know if anyone's heard the term a cougar, which is a derogatory term for an older woman with a younger man. But I think it does come down to that. Women are not allowed the same freedoms in a relationship that are afforded to men. And it would be great to see, definitely in our dispensation, if more women, who wanted to, court or marry younger men or younger men who wanted to marry older women, it would be great to kind of see those stereotypes busted on their head, because I do believe it does come down to that misogynistic society where women aren't afforded the same rights as men.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I'm assuming most people here would agree with that as well. Just an observation. I think it was here in the UK a few years ago that, I can't remember what TV channel it was, but there was either one or a couple of older TV presenters. I think they had reached their 50s. They were women, and they were suing, I think it was the BBC, and what they were suing them was, the grounds on which they were suing them was that because they'd hit their 50s and they were old, and obviously their looks were fading, this is how they portrayed it, not as I'm saying it, that the BBC were basically sidelining them, and their argument was men, as they got older, 50, 60, even into their late 60s, they still had prime time TV coverage as news presenters. Their age didn't make any difference, and they said this was sexist because they would replace the older women with younger women. If people are familiar with this, I think it's called is it called the Fox woman or the Fox presenter? It's not obviously true. It's just a phrase that's come out recently that Fox News, we all know about Fox News, they have a certain style of female presenter. They have to have a certain body shape. It's not to say that they just let anybody present. The women that do that work are highly intelligent, very capable women, but their mental capability is not enough. They actually have to have a body that's whatever Fox's image of beauty is. They have to have a certain style of woman, long legs, blonde, that kind of thing. And when you get to a certain age, you kind of get sidelined, and you get replaced. And so this feeds into the same mentality of sexism that is really foul in society, and probably many of us in the movement, even though we would claim that we're not sexist, would kind of have the same problem. I don't know how many men here are single, but how many of us single men would be willing to marry a woman who's, as the question said, 9 years older? Because I think most men wouldn't have a problem if they were the 33-year-old marrying a 24-year-old woman. And I suspect if you're 40 as a man, you wouldn't have a problem marrying a 24-year-old woman.
30 or 20-year gap, what about that now?
Yeah.
It's quite acceptable for the other way.
So would a 24-year-old
want to marry a 54-year-old
man marry a 54-year-old woman? It's
I think it's massive social stigma.
Yeah.
Could I say this though?
Brother Brian, sorry.
Yeah. One thing that people would have to consider in the age gap issue is that when the one partner is young, they still have a lot of life in them to do stuff, and the older partner has been there and done that, and you might have serious problems up ahead as the relationship grows. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, Sister Emma.
Yes, and I was going to say, I know quite a few older people who've got more energy than some of the young people now, and more healthy perhaps, because there's a lot of sickness it seems in young people. But I agree with what you're saying in principle, and I guess that's Ellen White's point, isn't it, about this disparity of not being able to keep up with the other one.
Yes, Ellen White talks about the issue of childbearing, about sickness, and also the I guess what you're bringing out, Brother Brian, the mental attitude of an older person compared to a younger person. That someone in their 20s might want to do lots of things, and an older person just says, I'd rather just stay at home and do nothing. I think all of those things need to be considered when finding a partner. But as Sister Emma says, today many older people are just as much active and vital and excited about life than younger people are.
Amen.
Who was that?
Sophie.
Our Sister Sophie. Someone asked a question. Is it alright to be thinking about getting married in the times we're living in? Yes, I think it's unavoidable. We're driven to be in relationships. I think we're almost driven to desire to be married. It's in our nature. It's not to say that it's wrong to stay single. I think we addressed that last week. In the season in which we find ourselves, this was Sister Sophie's question, it's perfectly fine not to marry, but it's also perfectly fine to marry, I would suggest. What are the prerequisites that we should be looking at in a partner to have a balanced relationship? I have no idea. There's so much to that, to what we expect of a partner. And I think this goes to what I said a few moments ago. I think a part of the problem that we're confronted with, and I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying it's a function of the times in which we live, because we don't have social relationships generally. We don't live close to families. We don't have family days often. We live at a distance from them. Our parents can live hundreds of miles away, maybe even on a different continent to the children. They don't meet often. In our communities, we don't have relationships with people in our community, and particularly us as Adventists. We seem not to fit into society. All the things that they'll do in a small town, whether it's a party night or a carnival or whatever it is. We don't engage in so many social things, and by and large our Adventist community is too small. Now in some of the larger cities, say in the UK or in the United States or even in Africa, in some of the African countries, if you live in a community that has many Adventists, your social needs can be met. But obviously we're in the movement and many of our Adventist ties have been cut. So part of the problem is that when we look for a partner, we expect them to be sort of multifunctional. I don't know if you all know what a Swiss Army knife is. It's a pen knife. It doesn't just have a blade. It has many bits and pieces to it, that it can do anything. It can be all things to all people. And that's what we expect of our spouses nowadays. And it can be quite demanding. So when he talks about the prerequisites that we should be looking for in a partner to have a balanced relationship, I think a problem that we confront, not only us, society in general does, is that we've become very demanding of what we expect out of a partner. And I don't mean it's just because we've become picky or fussy or we just expect more. I think it's a much more fundamental problem in our nature, that because we don't have other relationships, we expect much more from a partner. So I think that is one of the major issues that a couple need to consider when they talk about prerequisites in a partner. It's not just the fact that you're both vegan, you're both on the message. Obviously those things are obvious ones. The issue of education can have an impact on people, but it shouldn't. But formal education shouldn't be a stumbling block between people, because there are many people who what we would call self-educated. They are extremely intelligent. They have a high IQ or whatever metric you want to use, and they may not necessarily have gone through a formal education. They may not even have a particularly good job or a profession. It doesn't mean they're not intelligent. So I don't know if other people have got any thoughts about prerequisites that we should be looking for in a partner to have a balanced relationship. I think there are just so many things. This is why people should go through counselling, whether it's someone professional or someone in the movement or a self-help book of some form, to help guide you through what it is that you want in a partner. Brother Rayan. Go ahead, Brother Rayan. Yep, his hand's up. He's unmuted. Can you hear me, Brother Rayan? Rayan?
He's talking. You're muted, I think, Rayan. Your mic seems to be going up and down.
So I'm gonna move on. As soon as you get your mic working, just interrupt me, Rayan, because you look like you're unmuted.
Okay.
Oh, yes, okay. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, if I could make a comment on that. I think that question is such a relevant question, because there's so many prerequisites that one could desire of another person, and whenever you desire to get into a relationship with another person, they're not coming with, a standard checklist that you can just tick off. It's a package, and there's goods and there's bads. But I think the first thing one would need to do is recognize who and what they are in themselves first, as they clearly define and establish their own values and where they stand and where they cross lines and where their boundaries are. That would be my thought on that issue. Understanding where you fit in society and where you fit in your relationships and how you deal with those.
I agree with that. I think it's really important. I think a little while ago here in our house we were having a conversation about prerequisites, and I'd watched a TED presentation, if everybody knows TED, TED, and I can't remember the title of the presentation itself, but it spoke about the person that you need to marry. And the title was intriguing enough for me to watch it. It was a short presentation, and essentially the presenter was saying that the person you need to marry is yourself. And the point that the person wanted to make was that they're in their third, I think they'd been married 3 times and they're in their 4th relationship, but they're not married yet. And the reason why all those relationships had not worked, those marriages that the person had been in, was because the person didn't understand themselves. And they were looking for someone to either fix them or help them or to do something for them. And it took them 3 relationships to work out that actually the problem was that they didn't understand who they were. So I think this is the point that Brother Rayon's making. I think it's a really valid point, that you really do need to understand yourself. The problem is most of us don't. Most of us don't understand how we work. We don't even understand the generic makeup of a human being. We would call it the nature of man. We're not even sure how the nature of man really works. We really have a superficial understanding about our construction, just at a psychological level and a physiological level and an emotional level. And because we don't know ourselves well enough, we get into a partnership expecting people to meet our needs when we don't even know if some of the needs that we're expecting them to meet are legitimate. So in many situations, things can seem like a doomed project, purely because we don't even know the prerequisite. As Brother Ryan said, we don't even know ourselves properly, and that is a harder task than many of us can really appreciate or realise. In the olden days, if we're conservatives, we would say something along these lines, which does have truth to it. I'm not saying disparaging that unless you've got a good relationship with Christ, unless you're secure in your walk with Him, you shouldn't marry, because you cannot get your spouse to fill the gap that God is going to be there to fill. I think there is truthfulness to that, but there's just the principle of actually being secure in your walk, knowing who you are, knowing what you want, being content with yourself, is really important before you marry. And I think that goes back to something Sister Sophie said last week about her question about seasons, is, for a person to actually feel comfortable as a single person to do whatever they want to do in that situation, and when they feel ready to marry. And she didn't define what it meant to be ready to marry, but I think part of it is this idea that you know in yourself that you're ready to make this next move, which means that you would know something about yourself, and far too many of us don't. I want to say one more thing on that issue. This is just to do with physiology. This is a pure physical phenomena. When children hit their early teens, around the age of 12 to 14, depending upon the individual, there's a variation, but also depending on whether you're a boy or a girl, because they hit this age slightly differently. Girls hit it slightly earlier than boys, but basically your brain chemistry changes. And if we think of your brain as being hard or soft, or hard or plastic, moldable, there's this change that happens around early teens, and this change continues for all of your teens into your 20s. And basically for girls, their brains, their physical chemistry changes around the early 20s, 20 to 22, that kind of a range. And for boys, it's up to around 24. So about 2 years after girls in their development of their brain. So without going into the intricacies of what happens to your brain during your teen years, if you know teenagers and you know that they do crazy things, they take risks, they don't care. If you tell them to be prudent, they don't know what prudence means. They take financial risks, sexual risks, that they do real crazy things. The reason they do that is part of this change in their brain structure. And the only point I want to say about all of that, when we talk about knowing ourselves as a prerequisite, one of the problems is that most people, if you're a boy below 24 and if you're a girl below about 22, you're not actually mature enough to actually make some of these decisions about knowing yourself. Which is why I think Ellen White speaks about the dangers of young marriages. It's really a risk to marry when you're in your very early 20s, just from a physiological level, separate to all the other issues about life experiences. So I think that's important. Next question. If people marry a divorcee, is it realistic to talk to the ex-wife or friends to get some background on that person? Okay, so you want to marry someone and that person is divorced. Is it correct or is it right for you to speak to that to your ex's previous partner? Is that right?
Your partner's ex.
Your partner's ex, the person that they're divorced. And I think you should do that. I think it's appropriate. I think it's responsible. I think it's fine to do that. it depends upon the circumstances, how and why, or what you would ask. We have been involved in some situations where we've been in that very situation where we have doubts about the person who is the divorcee, the one who's divorced, about who they are. And we've counselled people to seek out that partner's ex and approach them and ask them what went wrong in the marriage, what problems were there, to see if that character trait is being perpetuated in this relationship. So I think there is a place for that. It's much nicer if it can be done openly and frankly, so the partner who's the divorcee would be open about their ex, and they would say, sure, speak to them, ask them any questions that you want, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am. If it could be done in that way, I think it's really good. So I think it's wise and sensible to speak to your future partner's ex or their friends, the friends that they had in their sort of previous life. I think that should be done. Is it all right with racism increasing to get married to someone not of the same colour? It certainly is, and of not the same gender as well, potentially. Although as a movement we haven't addressed that issue. Is it all right? Yes. We should be marrying. We should not even be looking at people's colour to decide whether or not we should marry them. This is a legacy or an issue that Ellen White was grappling or dealing with in her generation. And if you watch some of the presentations that we did in Portugal, it was the studies on redemption. And redemption can be understood in a number of different ways. It technically means to be brought back, but it also means to be brought back to an original state. And we are now living on Earth, depending on which date you go for, around 150 years, when in America it was dangerous or wrong or a bad idea for a white person to marry a black person. We're not living in that dispensation, and therefore we should not be beholden to those rules or those standards. I think it's perfectly acceptable and right and proper to marry someone of a different colour. Sister Daisy.
Sorry, we have to bring this to a close now, unfortunately.
Sure.
Because we've run out of time.
Okay, I've just got two short questions. I'm just going to answer them really quickly, if that's okay. Then I'm going to close with prayer.
Sure.
If two people agree on their faith and other things, is it all right at this time to disregard the age difference? So we've addressed the issue of age, and I'm going to say yes. Age difference about age is something that people worry about too much. Last question. Now that equality is becoming more known in the movement, is the head of the household still the man, or do we read that in a different way now? The head of the household is not the man. We should be viewing our marriages in a completely different way. And unfortunately, especially for people who are already married, particularly those who have been Adventist for a number of years, which would tend to mean that they're conservative if they're in this movement. In my experience, my observation, the men find it very difficult to cope with this change in headship. They really do struggle with this a lot, and I think it's something that particularly older men who are in existing marriages should really take heed to how they are approaching their marriages. And in fact, what I have found in the recent past, since this is becoming an increasingly important issue, is that marriages are beginning to hit rocky ground. They're beginning to be shaken, and people see this as evidence that something is going wrong. They say, if this message was so true, the issue of equality, Shouldn't marriages be getting stronger? Shouldn't they be on a more firm footing? And what they're identifying is that sisters are crying out, are demanding that their voices are heard. They're demanding equality. And the reason why marriages are struggling at the moment is because there may be some place where sisters, in finding their feet, maybe are not doing things in the right way. Maybe they're asking for things that perhaps in a wrong way. But I think that's, if we were to put a number to it, that would be like 1% of the problem. 99% of the problem is actually the husbands are not willing to relinquish power and authority that they hold over their wives. And this is the overarching problem that many couples are finding in their marriages. Either the wives are afraid to take their rightful position as partners in their marriage, or the men, as the women are trying to do that, the men are stopping them. And if a woman is brave enough to fight for her rights, because both are normally in the movement, often the man will disregard everything that's being taught and fall back to that headship mentality. And if a woman, as I say, is brave enough, they begin to get conflict in their marriage. And this conflict is happening on multiple levels. Either the wife is shutting down because her needs are not being met, or she becomes forceful. If you're in this situation, then you know that something is going wrong on the issue of accepting equality. And as I say, it's like 99% to 1%. The problem is with the brothers on this issue, that they're not willing to relinquish their what they perceive as their ordained or God-given right to lead their family. And the other problem is that I've experienced is that men will say something along this line in frustration. They say, okay, we'll do it your way. You take charge, you run things. And, a hypothetical situation, they'll say, okay, you deal with the finances now, knowing full well that the sister, their wife, is untrained in these things. And so what they're actually doing is a form of manipulation where they know that the wife will fail in this endeavour because they haven't received the support that they need, the training in order to do this thing. And that is open sin. So the issue of the head of the household is a huge issue that we're being confronted with at the moment. And for those men who think it's okay that women just become their equals and say, okay, now we're equals, you have to bear half of the burdens, or you do things that I used to do, without any kind of training, are doing this to basically put down their wives and keep them in their place of subjection and submission, which is totally wrong to do. So this is a huge problem in the movement that we're facing, particularly with people who are already married. If you are not already married and you're in a relationship, or you're looking to enter into a relationship and you're a sister, this is one of the things that you need to be really sure about when it talks about prerequisites or knowing the person that you want to marry, is to make sure that this man that you're thinking of actually understands his role and his place, both in society and in the marriage, in the wedding. So I think that's all the questions we can go through. So, Sister Daisy, did you want to ask a question now, or shall I pray? Your hand's up.
No, the hand signal was to be like time.
Okay. So, let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. Lord, even though many of us are struggling with our relationships, some who are already in a marriage relationship, some who are seeking for marriage but are finding it difficult to either find a partner or they may be in a courtship and they're struggling with their relationships. Lord, each of us are in a different situation, but each of us has one need: to be loved and to be respected. We know, Lord, that you gave us earthly relationships to fulfill and to feed our need of companionship and care and attention and love. And we have singularly failed in that pursuit of happiness. As we bow before you, Lord, may it be our heartfelt prayer, whenever we find ourselves in our relationships, that we would learn to do better. If we're married and our marriage relationship is breaking down because we are not exercising true equality, help us, Lord, to consider our situation. If we're in a courtship and things are going wrong, help us to understand, Lord, why those things are happening. Help us to understand why it is we're not meeting the needs of our potential partner. And Father, if we're single and we desire a partner, first of all, Lord, I want to pray that those prayers of those people are met, that they will be shown someone with whom they can enter into a relationship with. Lord, may you fulfill our heart's desires according and in agreement with your will. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.